Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, hope my mic's okay still. I just tested it, seems fine. I have to learn not to touch the controls. How you guys doing? You good? Good if good, bad if bad. Well, you'll be good soon. Don't worry, my friend. Let's do it. Battle of Savo Island, 1942, America's worst naval defeat. This is an hour and 4-minute long video, and there's no way I can do this in full. It'd be like an hour and a half long reaction. So I'm going to separate it into 2 parts. Let's do it. If you're new to the channel, hello, my name's Connor. I like to learn about history through YouTube recommendations. If you're interested in that, I'd love to have you. Join the Discord. The original link to the video will be at the top of the description below. Right below that will be the link to the Discord. Just click on that. It'll send you right over. Let's do it. If you're not ready to learn, get out. You're in the wrong class. Okay.
Many see the Battle of Midway as the high watermark of the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. But this belief is incorrect. Although Japan had been defeated, it was far from a defeated force. The Japanese still had a numerical advantage over the US Pacific Fleet in almost every major category of warships. And the Americans would soon come to find out on the night of August 9th, 1942, that the Japanese surface fleet, particularly its heavy cruisers, was a force to be reckoned with. Admiral King was the commander-in-chief of the US fleet. From the moment hostilities commenced with Japan, he had been eagerly waiting to go on the offensive. The only thing preventing him from doing so was the powerful Kido Butai the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed. However, with the decisive victory at Midway, which saw the core of Japan's carriers destroyed, King realized a golden opportunity had arisen. With Japan's offensive power now blunted, he finally had his chance to take the initiative. As things stood, he had already seen the South Pacific as the perfect place to start. So he ordered for an offensive to retake Tulagi.
This is Guadalcanal.
A seaplane base.
I've heard of Guadalcanal, but I never really knew when or really where it was. So, all right, let's do it.
Japanese had established back in May.
Wait, what?
A seaplane base. So he ordered for an offensive to retake Tulagi, a seaplane base the Japanese had established back in May. Planning had begun for an invasion to commence in the fall, and Vice Admiral Gormley was selected as the theater commander. But then, on July 2nd, everything changed. American intelligence revealed that apart from the seaplane base at Tulagi, the Japanese were beginning work on an airfield across Savo Sound on the island of Guadalcanal. This was bad news. From this position, land-based aircraft could threaten the sea lanes and communication lines between the US and her ally, Australia. The Allies could not let this happen. And so it was that Operation Watchtower was created. The objective was taking Tulagi and in addition Guadalcanal before its airfield could be made operational. Much to Admiral Gormley's dismay, his original deadline for an invasion in the fall was moved up to August. In great haste, planning was undertaken in what truly was an improvised operation. Despite the tight time schedule and logistical challenges, Operation Watchtower was considered ready to commence on the last day of July. On July 31st, an armada of 82 ships carrying 19,000 Marines began its journey towards Guadalcanal. Bad weather shielded the expeditionary force from being spotted, allowing them to surprise the Japanese.
I just want to say I'm much more excited now than even I was at the beginning because I didn't know that this was Guadalcanal. All right.
When they entered Savo Sound on August 7th. Following aerial and naval bombardments, the 1st Marine Division began landing its troops. The first offensive of the United States in the Pacific had just begun. In the early morning of August 7th, the Japanese main fleet base at Rabaul received an urgent message from Tulagi. Enemy task force sighted. It was followed by another message an hour later reporting that they were being bombed and that enemy landing preparations were underway. And then a final transmission at 0805. Enemy forces overwhelming. We will defend our post to the death, praying for eternal victory. And after that, nothing was ever heard from the station again. Although the Japanese had been caught by complete surprise by this bold operation, their reaction was quick and decisive. Vice Admiral Mikawa, age 53, was in charge of the recently formed 8th Fleet. Mikawa was an experienced commander and was recognized for his judgment and courage. Described as gentle and soft-spoken, he could also be aggressive, and this was confirmed by his reaction to the invasion. Upon hearing of the Allied landings, a plan immediately sprung to his mind: attack. He took several immediate actions. First, he sent reconnaissance flights to gather more intelligence on the enemy. This was followed by ordering all his available forces to assemble before he set out to strike the Allies. In addition to all this, an airstrike was dispatched to bombard the Allied naval forces at Savo Sound. It soon became apparent to Mikawa that this might not just be a raiding force, but instead something much bigger, since aircraft carriers were reportedly involved in providing air cover for the landings. Given this scenario, he settled on a night action to strike the Allied invasion force. His reasons were as follows, quote, "My choice of a night action was made because I had no air support on which to rely, and reliable air support was vital to anything but a night action. On the other hand, I had complete confidence in my ships and knew that the Japanese Navy's emphasis on night battle training and practice would ensure our chances of success in such an action even without air support." Mikawa's plan heavily relied on making a careful approach and maintaining the element of surprise. He would avoid added reconnaissance planes during the day and then at midday make a dash down the New Georgia Sound and enter Savo Sound at night. A quick and devastating attack would be delivered, followed by a prompt withdrawal under the cover of darkness before American carrier aircraft could retaliate. He sent a dispatch to Tokyo suggesting his plan. The Naval General Staff originally opposed it at first, believing it to be rash and reckless, but then reconsidered. What other option did they have? Let the Americans establish themselves on the island unimpeded? No way! The Japanese spirit was that of attack, and they weren't about to let the Americans take their islands without a fight. So at 1330, they approved Mikawa's bold operation. At 1630, Mikawa took off to rendezvous with the forces he had been able to gather. His force was composed of his flagship, the cruiser Chokai, 4 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 6, the Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, 2 light cruisers, Tenru and Yubari, and a single destroyer.
Can I just say, I always wondered, before understanding the significance of air power, why carriers were so important. It seems like they were the untrained eye, I guess, as I do have when it comes to naval combat, for sure. They're just sitting ducks, and they would be easy to take off if you got too close to them. And that, battleships and destroyers might be better, but clearly they have strike groups with them that protect them, and able to have airplanes fly off of your deck and come back on and strike much further than any gun, or they didn't even have really missiles. Any gun or torpedo or whatever could, makes a lot of sense, but let's see what the Japanese can do without them.
Nagi. It was a small force, but it would have to do. Although most of these ships were not top-of-the-line fleet units, they were still a formidable force. The following day, on August 8th, Mikawa saw an Allied plane circling above him at 10:25. Moments later, Chokai intercepted a sighting report this aircraft had sent out. Then, at 11:03, another aircraft was spotted surveying him. At this point, it was clear to Mikawa that Surprise had been lost. His entire plan had been banking on this, and now it was possible that the Americans would follow up this sighting with an airstrike. So to lessen the chance of this, he would have to postpone his approach even further into the evening so he could use the cover of darkness as protection. And yet, despite this, Mikawa still had reasons to be optimistic. Reconnaissance flown that day revealed to him that although he was greatly outnumbered by Allied ships, the Allies were operating them in two separate groups. This was excellent news. Mikawa could exploit this mistake and defeat each force in detail. Bearing this in mind, regardless of the odds stacked against him, and having the element of surprise gone, Mikawa decided to press on with the mission. At 1600, he began his approach down the new Georgia Sound, which would soon acquire the nickname the Slot. Tensions on board Mikawa's ships were high, since there was a possibility an American airstrike would come. Despite this potential threat, Mikawa had to move on to other matters, his pre-battle plan.
I'm assuming the anti-aircraft guns or strength of the capability of anti-aircraft is stronger on destroyers and battleships than it is on aircraft carriers, right?
His force, apart from Cruiser Division 6, had never worked together as a group, so he decided to keep it simple. No complicated battle formations here, just a simple column formation would be fine.
I gotta take a piss, guys, before this starts. All right. All right, back to the video. Go.
At 1640, the pre-battle plan was issued to his men. We will penetrate south of Savo Island and torpedo the enemy main force off Guadalcanal. Then, we will move toward the forward area at Tulagi and strike with torpedoes and gunfire. After which, we will withdraw to the north of Savo Island. And shortly after this message, Mikawa ordered his men to jettison all flammable materials off their ships, since they could pose a deadly fire hazard in the upcoming fight. The sun set at 1816 and tensions on board eased as it became clear that no air attack was coming. That evening, Chokai intercepted a ship to the north of Savo Island. And shortly after this message, Mikawa ordered his men to jettison all flammable materials off their ships, since they could pose a deadly fire hazard in the
They learned that from Midway the hard way.
upcoming fight. The sun set at 1816 and tensions on board eased as it became clear that no air attack was coming. That evening, Chokai intercepted American carrier signals, confirming to Mikawa that the carriers were indeed out there somewhere. But where exactly? But wait, this also brought up another question. Why hadn't they attacked? Apparently, the Americans hadn't taken advantage of the early morning report given to them. No air...
That's a great example of what I'd imagine. I know this is going to be a long video, even though I'm cutting it in half, but still. That just reminds you of, or just makes you think of a situation where the crew on the ship are probably very relieved, being like, oh God, thank God, no air attack. But I bet you the captain and the higher-ups are like, why aren't they attacking? Something else is up.
Attack had materialized. Heck, even additional scout planes hadn't been seen. This was strange. Then, later in the evening, further great news was delivered to Mikawa. The air group that had attacked Allied shipping this day had returned to Rabaul, and they had given an incredible battle report. They claimed having sunk 14 ships and heavily damaged 3 more. Well, apparently the odds were even better now. Things were looking up. At 2313, 3 floatplanes were launched ahead of Mikawa's fleet. This would be a unique tactic that the Allies would never counter, let alone match. These planes were tasked with dropping flares right before the battle. This would illuminate the enemy forces and give Mikawa a tactical edge over his opponents.
What do you mean float planes? So which one of those ships is carrying aircraft or float planes? Because there's no way that the float planes are just traveling alongside the group, right?
As midnight approached, spirits were undoubtedly high. Mikawa's forces were trained for night actions, and it would soon be their chance to prove it. In a message reminiscent of Admiral Nelson's speech before his great victory at Trafalgar, Mikawa had signaled his ships earlier that evening. In the finest tradition of the Imperial Navy, we shall engage the enemy in night battle. Every man is expected to do his best. His men would not disappoint. The Japanese had the finest night binoculars in the world, and at 43 minutes past midnight, lookouts caught sight of an enemy destroyer at an incredible distance of over 5 miles. Mikawa's ships reduced speed and altered course so as to slip by. 50 guns were trained on this little destroyer, ready to blow it out of the water if it sounded an alarm. But nothing happened. The lone destroyer seemed oblivious to his presence and was moving farther and farther away. He couldn't believe it. Miraculously, he was able to pass by it undetected. Mikawa was truly on a lucky streak. First, no American airstrikes had reached him, despite having been spotted, and now he was able to slip by this weak picket screen? Had he truly achieved surprise? Or maybe this was a clever trap, with the Americans waiting to ambush him. Regardless of what was to come, he knew that his men were well trained and equipped to handle whatever came their way. He increased speed to 26 knots, and at 0133 gave the order, "All ships, attack." Mikawa couldn't have known it at the time, but he had actually achieved complete surprise.
How did those planes not alert American?
How Mikawa was able to travel 700 miles without being detected is a question we will answer shortly. But first, we need to take a step back and go over the landings that took place 2 days prior. Rear Admiral Richmond Turner was in command of the amphibious force conducting the landings on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Age 57, he has been described by author John Lundstrom as a tough, bright, even brilliant officer. But according to others who knew him, said he could also be arrogant, domineering, tactless, and egotistic. Either way, his bold, aggressive leadership is just what an operation like this needed. His entrance into the Sound caught the enemy by surprise. The landings for Tulagi and the nearby islets of Gavutu Tanambogo began at 0800 hours. They will be taken successfully, but only after a brief but fierce fight. The entire Japanese garrison of 1,500 men fought as they promised, virtually down to the last man. The Marines suffered 248 casualties in this engagement. Guadalcanal, on the other hand, proved much easier, since the garrison on the island were actually just construction crews working on the unfinished airfield. Once the Marines landed, the laborers fled into the jungle. The Americans were able to secure the airfield the following day. As mentioned, the Japanese had reacted immediately to the landings. By happenstance, they had already planned a bombing raid that day against land targets in New Guinea. So the force was diverted to bombard the transports instead. Unfortunately for them, because of the prior mission, the planes were not armed with torpedoes, their deadly preferred weapons. But they didn't want to delay the attack by rearming them, so they decided they would send them as they were. Right behind them would be another strike, 9 Val dive bombers. Given the distance, they did not have the fuel to strike and return to base. Regardless of this, they were sent and simply towed to ditch near the Shortland Islands and await rescue. The bombers took off at 0950, the dive bombers at 1045. Any hope of achieving surprise was dashed when Coast Watchers sighted the bombers and warned the Expeditionary Force. This gave the Allies precious time to prepare for their arrival. The bombers arrived over the area at 1315 and were greeted by 18 fighters. Unfortunately for the Japanese, because they were bombing from such a high altitude and through heavy clouds, their accuracy suffered. The bombers scored no hits. Apart from achieving nothing, the strike had also lost 2 zeros and 6 bombers. Then, an hour later, the 9 Val dive bombers appeared. They managed to score a single hit that lightly damaged a destroyer. 5 Vals were shot down, and the remaining 4 exited the area to ditch their planes at their designated location. The Americans had successfully defended their beachhead, but losses had been heavy for them. 9 Wildcat fighters and 1 Dauntless bomber had been lost. This Japanese raid on the 7th had proven to be ineffective, and their second attempt the following day would be even worse. On August 8th, Rabaul ordered a new strike on the Allied ships. 26 Betty bombers with 15 Zeros as escorts. This was the airstrike that would eventually report back to Mikawa that it had sunk and damaged a total of 17 ships. However, nothing could have been further from the truth. The attack had been a complete disaster.
What?
The 41 aircraft took off at 0800 hours. This time, the bombers were properly armed with torpedoes. Their
The title of the video is the biggest American naval defeat, so they must still...
original mission was to find the American carriers that were bound to be near Guadalcanal. However, this effort proved unsuccessful, so they diverted and went to attack the transports instead. They unexpectedly appeared over Florida Island and swooped down to attack. Only 3 American fighters were providing air cover, but were out of place to intercept them. Therefore, at 11:55, the situation looked grim.
How do you not hit a single plane and yet claim you hit 17?
23 torpedo bombers now had an open shot at all the ships in the Sound. It seemed that nothing stood in their way of achieving absolute destruction, except anti-aircraft fire, and lots of it. The Mitsubishi Navy Type 1 attack bomber, also known as the Betty, was the IJN's principal bomber. It was fast and had an extraordinary range, but was lightly constructed and weakly protected. It would gain a notorious reputation for not being able to withstand even the modest amount of damage before being engulfed in flames. It would soon acquire a nickname by the Allies, the Type 1 Lighter, and we're about to see why. A photograph was taken as they swooped down to attack. You can see the skills of the pilots by how low to the water they are. But at this low altitude...
Wow, look at this one. I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing to on the bottom left of the screen. Just so you guys know, I know you can see, obviously, me and my camera in the background image, but I can only see, if I have the video full screen. So that one on the bottom left.
Every anti-aircraft weapon on board the ships could be effective. And it was. The American ships put up an impressive barrage of fire, and bomber after bomber splashed into the water. One of them, so heavily damaged, intentionally crashed into the transport George F. Elliott. It started a fire so fierce that it eventually led to the scuttling of the ship. Only one bomber struck home, and it was on the hapless destroyer Jarvis. The destroyer was badly damaged, but remained afloat. A photograph captured the 2 victims of this air raid. Jarvis is seen here, down by the bow, and dead in the water. The George F. Elliott is in the background burning. She would eventually be scuttled later that evening. In 10 minutes, the attack was over. The few Bettys that survived exited the area, and that's when the horrific losses came to light. Apart from the 2 Zeros that were destroyed, 18 of the 23 bombers were also lost. The majority of them due to anti-aircraft fire. This would end up being the largest single loss of land-based air crews in the entire Guadalcanal campaign. 125 experienced airmen were lost, and all they had to show for it was a transport and a destroyer. By all measures, it had been a successful beginning to Operation Watchtower. The Allies had much to be proud of. They had withstood 3 separate air attacks with very little loss and had reached their main objectives successfully. The only real trouble for them had been the unloading of supplies. It had taken longer than planned. Nonetheless, to Admiral Turner, the operation was off to a good start. But after 2 days of constant operations, most of the sailors under his command were no doubt exhausted. It was hoped by many that this night would be a quiet one so they could finally get some rest. Two of the most important elements in any combat operation are intelligence and communications. And we are going to see that both fall short here. The air search and communications network the Allies had in place was feeble and allowed for the failure of detecting Mikawa's approach. And we will see that, like a chain of dominoes, it's going to be one failure after another until it all accumulates into putting the Allies in the worst possible state before Mikawa arrived. So we will begin by looking at the intelligence Admiral Turner had on the eve of battle. On the evening of August 8th, this is what the Admiral knew. He knew that 3 principal sightings had been made on the enemy. The first was the day prior, on August 7th. Submarine S-38 had spotted Mikawa's force heading southeast. But this report proved unhelpful since it had a Mikawa's force heading southeast. Since it had occurred a day ago and it gave no concrete indication that it was heading towards Guadalcanal. It might have just been heading towards Cavane or maybe even Buca.
Okay.
The second report would be the most crucial one and would be the one that would influence Turner the most. This was the sighting of Mikawa's force at 10:25 on August 8th. Unfortunately, there were 2 issues with this report. To begin with, the air crew's ship identification skills were very poor. It erroneously reported 2 seaplane tenders with the group. But more significantly is the fact
Okay, so that's how the seaplanes are transported.
that when the report had arrived to Turner that evening, it was over 8 hours old. So what's the explanation for this terrible delay? I think it's worth exploring this segment in that evening. It more significantly is the fact that when the report had arrived to Turner that evening, it was over 8 hours old. So what's the explanation for this terrible delay? I think it's worth exploring this segment in detail, since I believe it to be the primary reason for the debacle the Allies would face at Savo.
Okay.
That being the failure to detect Mikawa heading down the slot. In Turner's defense, he had very good reasons to believe that his forces would receive adequate warning if a Japanese force tried to attack his position. He had dozens of reconnaissance aircraft conducting searches. However, the devil was in the details. The problem was that there were 2 different commands in charge of the air searches. Turner was operating under the South Pacific Command Area, under Vice Admiral Gormley. However, the aircraft carrying out searches in the sector of Rabaul and the Northern Solomons belonged to the Southwest Pacific Command, under the responsibility of General Douglas MacArthur. An arrangement had been made between the 2 commanders. If a plane made a sighting, it would deliver its message to base, and if it was deemed urgent and pertinent to Operation Watchtower, it would be delivered directly to Admiral Turner.
Wonder where
Notice
Nimitz
then,
is.
Turner has no direct communication with these aircraft. In essence, Turner's security in his northern sector was entirely dependent on MacArthur and his aviators and for their ability to deliver messages in a timely manner. What could possibly go wrong? Well, something called Murphy's Law. Things didn't go as planned because a slight oversight had been made. Because of the secrecy Operation Watchtower was undertaken with, very few were told about this arrangement. And incredibly, this included the airbase and the airmen who were supposed to do the searches. In other words, senior command forgot to tell the airbase, hey guys, if you find something suspicious, let's say a force heading southeast that could threaten the Allied landings, let Admiral Turner know right away.
It was a technicality.
As a consequence, for the pilots, this was going to be another routine air search for them. They wouldn't have been looking for any potential threats that could endanger the landings because they weren't even aware the landings were taking place. As can be expected, repercussions
Jesus
were sure
Christ.
to follow.
Yeah.
So now with the groundwork set up, I will take a minute to explain in detail the passage of the 1025 message so you can fully grasp the failure of this mistake. At 1025, the force was spotted by the Australian search plane. The reported sighting was transmitted but not acknowledged at base. To the pilot's credit, he immediately returned to base to report it in person. At 12:42, his plane landed and the report was delivered. But the debriefing officer, being unaware of Operation Watchtower, deemed it not urgent. So he sent it following standard procedures, up the long chain of command. It was serenely sent to Port Moresby and then to Townsville, where it arrived at 14:37. It then lingered there for over 3 hours. Then the message was transmitted to Brisbane at 18:20. It was then dispatched to the naval radio station in Canberra, who then transmitted it all the way to Pearl Harbor, who then finally retransmitted it to the American ships at Guadalcanal.
I mean, is that really their fault? Unless I missed something, it seems to be the higher command's fault and not... Obviously, things have to be secret in order for them to be successful, element of surprise, but for not letting the MacArthur group know that Guadalcanal was occurring.
Canal. Wow, what a journey. What should have taken minutes to deliver had taken over 8 hours. Now, there was a third reported sighting shortly after the 1025 one, and this could have corrected these mistakes, except that it had a similar story. The reported sighting was deemed not urgent when delivered by the pilot, and it was sent the long way to Turner. The sighting arrived to Turner at 21:30, 10 and a half hours.
And it's not urgent if you don't know about the Guadalcanal landing, so...
Old. What we just witnessed was a breakdown of communications. Crucial information has been delayed at a moment when time mattered the most.
No, it's not a breakdown of communications. I mean, maybe it's a breakdown of, well, I guess, in a way, it's not a breakdown in the communication skills of the pilot or the commanders at, MacArthur and them. It's a breakdown of communication between the higher-ups and the, leaders of these campaigns.
Not understate this. If Turner had received a timely report, it's only logical to assume he would have sent additional scouts who probably would have located Mikawa, and then Turner could have ordered a preemptive airstrike as the Japanese had expected. Not to mention, all the ships at Savo Sound would have been prepared for Mikawa. How unfortunate for the Allies. So the communication factor was a mess, we can see that. This leaves Turner with what limited intelligence he had, and as will be seen, the poor skills of the pilots gave him a false view of the situation, one that lowered his guard. Admiral Turner had to make an assessment that evening, and he made it based on the 1025 report. Unfortunately, here we will see how the misidentification of the Japanese force played a fatal role. If we recall, the report had stated that there were 2 seaplane tenders with the group. Well, if that was true, Turner reasoned, then perhaps the Japanese were planning on building a seaplane base nearby. I mean, sure,
I'm going to split the videos soon and stop this first part, but I'm just waiting for a good point to do it. I'm going to do it before the attack.
There is an escort of 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers with them, but this small force would never dare to make a night attack, would they? And this is what Turner was guilty of. He was assuming what the Japanese would do, and not taking into account their capabilities. In other words, Turner's battle plan was based on what the enemy would do, not could do. Given this evaluation, the conclusion reached that night was that the enemy's most likely course of action would be to establish a seaplane base and not to attack. But to be fair to Turner, he didn't make this decision simply based on a hunch that the enemy wouldn't come any further south. He had been rightly concerned about his northwestern approaches, specifically the slot. So much so that he had ordered an afternoon search to cover this area. If Mikawa had continued southeast, he surely would have been spotted. However, there was yet again another failure of communications. Turner sent the order, but his seaplane tender never received it. Thus, no afternoon search was flown that day, although Turner had assumed it had. And since there had been no reports, he took it as evidence that this force had not gone down the slot. It wasn't until about midnight that Turner was informed that the slot had never been searched that afternoon. So the question in Turner's mind was, had this force continued south? Turner didn't know. The verdict: although it was logical to assume that the enemy would build a seaplane base, it should not have been discounted that the report could have been inaccurate. Given this possibility, he should have provided his commanders with a situation report and a threat assessment, letting them know that although unlikely, a night attack should not be discounted completely. This way, the commanders could have taken precautions. But unfortunately for the Allies, this wasn't what happened. Turner, confident in his belief that the Japanese were building a seaplane base and not coming to attack, did nothing to raise the alert status of his ships. And I have to mention here that there is a bit of American overconfidence at play. The Allies did have a sense of superiority over their opponents, and given a worst-case scenario where they were attacked, they were comforted in their belief that they could handle themselves. Even Turner would later admit when reviewing his forces, "I was satisfied with arrangements and hoped the enemy would attack. I believed they would get a warm reception." Two things to this. One, Turner obviously didn't know about the Japanese Navy's expertise in night fighting. If so, he would have been more modest in his wording. And two, a look at their poor dispositions would have shown their overconfidence to be unwarranted.
This is a good place to stop. 30 minutes in. All right, guys, this is, knowing this is Guadalcanal, much more interesting to me. I'll be ready to react to the second part of this either later today or tomorrow. I'm going to get to the 30 Years' War and Caesar episodes right now. Hope you guys are doing well. See you next time.